You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, I'm excited to welcome Pablo Juarez, Master's in Education, Board Certified Behavior Analyst, and Director of the Treatment and Research Institute for Autism Spectrum Disorders. That's the TRIAD in the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center. On today's podcast, we'll talk about the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center TRIAD Community Engagement Program, which is an innovative partnership with community, cultural, and civic organizations that work to promote full inclusion of all children and adults. Pablo Juarez is the perfect person to talk to because he's been honored for his work in Tennessee with supporting the inclusion of children and adults with ASD in the community. His emphasis on extending services to lower resourced communities has opened doors across Tennessee and brought about inventive ways to increase access to care. Pablo, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you on because I think the conversations we're going to have today are ones that need to be brought to the forefront. And it's not only on community supports, but on treatment models and care models, and really understanding that marriage between community, recipient of care, and the provider community as well. But before we go there, is that everybody's journey to this path came about differently. And your journey obviously has a heavy impact on community access and being able to really empower communities. So how did you start your travel and becoming a behavior analyst and focusing on this care?
Yeah, it's an interesting journey. It's it might be cliche to say it, but it started back when I was a child. My grandparents didn't speak English for a long period of time, and the only job they could get in Central Texas was, picking agriculture and harvesting. And so a big part of their lives were spent in fields and on farms picking cotton and other types of produce. And my dad did some of that until, and his siblings, until my grandmother learned enough English to get a job as a teaching assistant in a special education classroom in Central Texas. And so ever since I was a kid, I've known about disabilities and had access to disabilities. She would often babysit some of the kids from her class, and families would come over and hang out. So I've been around disabilities for a long period of time, ever since then. And then, I got into school and really started to focus on soccer. And I played soccer all the way through high school. Had a very bad injury that required some back surgery my junior year in high school. And while that was terrible and I lost some scholarship offers, what was great was that the special education teacher came to me and said, "Will you help me coach Special Olympic soccer?" And I was like, "Yes, I would. I would love to." And I did, and I loved it. And it was really powerful for me. And I ended up getting a job in a group home, a local residential home that like 6 of these guys from the soccer team lived in, and spent summers there. I lived for a summer in the house with them, which was amazing. But got my start as a direct service personnel right away in high school. Went to college to become a special education teacher, which was at the University of North Texas, where I started to focus on soccer. And I played soccer all the way through high school. Had a very bad injury that required some back surgery my junior year in high school. And while that was terrible and I lost some scholarship offers, what was great was that the special education teacher came to me and said, "Will you help me coach Special Olympic soccer?" And I was like, "Yes, I would. I would love to." And I did, and I loved it. And it was really powerful for me. And I ended up getting a job in a group home, a local residential home that like 6 of these guys from the soccer team lived in, and spent summers there. I lived for a summer in the house with them, which was amazing. But got my start as a direct service personnel right away in high school. Went to college to become a special education teacher, which was at the University of North Texas, where I kind of fell into the behavior analysis program and realized the impact it could have, and kind of fell in love with that as a future road for me. So that's essentially how I got my start.
Well, I mean, just knowing that your journey started at a young age is that you were immersed in the community, in the culture, in the decision making, and especially with your job being focused towards disability and athletics as that primary one, is that you're representing people that you were able to kind of get their voice, understand their needs, being able to do that. I would imagine that that played huge dividends in the way that you perceive treatment and in the way that you're trying to engage people. And I guess for me and for others, I'd love to know kind of, what the goal of the triad is and how that might tie into some of those learning experiences that you had.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think TRIAD has evolved quite a bit, and we started in the mid '90s. Wendy Stone started TRIAD, primarily focused on autism diagnosis, and we became one of the first sites in the country to be able to reliably diagnose children with autism from the ages of 12 to 18 months, and that continues to be a big focus for us. Is how do we develop services that provide diagnostic assessments to those who need it as early as possible and as quickly as possible. So fast forward from then to now, we're kind of pioneering a way of providing diagnostic assessments directly via telepractice within homes. And we're able to do this in, low income rural communities, almost always with whatever those families have in their homes. And so, that's been kind of the big journey for us as from start to finish. But along the way, we started to pick up other activities and develop other service lines, particularly in regards to some of the work we do within the state. So, we can develop programs to support behavioral health or academic growth or early intervention or, mental health activities. We can do all those things, but the way we want to do them and is a way that is sustainable and they can work within existing systems of care. So that's why we work very closely with our partners at the Tennessee Department of Education or the Tennessee Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities or the Tennessee Department of Health. We really want to be in these big systems that allow us access to communities across the state, no matter where they are, whether they're in, an impoverished inner city or they're in the Appalachian Mountains. So for us, all the work we do is really any program we develop. It's focused on rural, low-income access. And so whatever a wealthy family can accomplish in Nashville is great, but we should be able to have similar gains and similar outcomes for families who live in far Northeast Tennessee. So I think for us, being able to think about those communities we're working in and serving is really important because there's some cultural sensitivity that comes along with those too. Working with families in an inner city is very different than working from families at the foothill of some mountains in a town that gets very little in terms of resources, and they come with different cultural needs and different cultural expectations. So, we can't develop good, thoughtful service lines if we're not taking those community and cultural needs at the very core of what we're doing and how we're developing it. So for us, that's a very important approach, is really involving the community in all of that development.
Well, I really appreciate the fact that that is the focus, because I can say is that I've been in the field for a while now, about 20 years. And when I came into the field, I will say is that it really was a one size fits all model, is taking into consideration the needs of the community, those cultural aberrations that occur across every group wasn't the focus. And I think we were doing it inadvertently wrong, good intended, but inadvertently wrong. And I think over time, we've learned so much to realize that a behavioral model can exist for everybody, but we have to listen to that community partner to really understand how to get buy-in, how to modify our treatment to meet the needs of that community, and to start getting away from those inequalities that exist that you had talked about as far as rural or underserved or sociodemographic areas that just don't have access to care. I guess, what are you seeing on that level as far as, I mean, are there inherent inequalities that exist right now that maybe we need to continue to kind of bring to the forefront?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I think you talked about socioeconomic. There's a lot to consider there in service delivery. Is one is we can figure out what technology to use and to put in homes, or if we're working with a family, say through. So here's an example. We might have a family come through our telediagnostic autism service. So the Tennesse Early Intervention System may refer a family to us because they think this child may have autism. And so we'll zoom into their home and provide a diagnostic assessment via telepractice. And we either say, yes, your child has autism, no, they don't have autism, or we're not sure. We need you to come into a clinic, or we'll send a clinician closer to you. So that way we can spend some more time and really dig into it. Or it might be that, we're not sure. Why don't we see you again in 6 months? But in the meantime, regardless of what we tell you, we're going to enroll your child into some level of service delivery because we know they're going to need it. Now, we've worked with families who don't have the technology for that, or they don't have the data plans for that. So we'll send them, devices and hotspots and those types of things. But then there become challenges if there's not broadband access, or there become challenges if families aren't comfortable, and that's a big one. Is we found over, since the start of the pandemic, families have become much more comfortable with telepractice and this type of technology because it's ubiquitous in a lot of ways. But still, it requires a level of trust to be able to do that. And it all comes down to relationships. And a lot of the inequalities we identify through that initial relationship building phase, which is really important. We can't just dive in and say, here's what we're going to do, here's what you need to do, X, Y, and Z, we're done, see you later. We have to really do some initial work to try to identify where the comfort is, where the needs are, what are the things we should focus on, are there certain things we should do and shouldn't do. And those are going to vary greatly from family to family, even within the same community. So it all comes down to that individual relationship level. And those things are hard to do systematically. It's hard to build that into a system because we want systems to be efficient and fast, and we want to reduce cost. But there's just no way to really to build trust without that initial relationship building phase. That has to be a part of any system that we develop.
And it sounds like you all are tackling that system right now. I mean, historically, what it was a bunch of clinicians getting in a room and deciding this is what we're doing. And without too much of the input from the community, without the input from different cultures, without the neurodiverse input. I think what I'd love for you to kind of have the platform is explain to the group and explain to everyone is, that initiative that you all are putting in place, the community-based instruction. What is that? And how is that filling the gap right now?
Thank you for asking. There are kind of two big focus areas of that. One is, building community, and what does it look like to actually immerse a community in education and technical assistance and support in building services and resources that are truly inclusive for people with disabilities. That's a whole community approach. And then there's the idea of service delivery development. So how do we think about the services we provide on an individual level, not just a community level, but like if we're providing behavior analytics services, what are the things we need to think about there that are community informed? So, we can talk first about kind of the whole community approach. And I think that one's really important is, we have a family training program here called Families First. And it's a really important program for us because it is our opportunity to work directly with families in a pretty substantial way. So families can come into us. We basically have a session where they come in person. We've been doing it virtually lately, but it's great when it can happen in person because it becomes this sort of hybrid between like a training session, but also a support group session because there are other families there, and we're able to kind of ask each other questions and build conversations and build relationships with people who are facing similar challenges. Now, through those, we can teach families how to, of young children with autism, for example, how to best support their child in going to, let's say, the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. And maybe the child really loves country music and that's what they want to do. But getting into the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum is really expensive. And if you're taking an entire family there, only to go in and fear perhaps that something in the environment is going to upset your child, and we may end up in a meltdown and you have to leave after a couple of minutes. You've potentially spent a lot of money just to go in and see, a very small number of things, and then have your child in a really vulnerable state that you also have to be able to support and think about too. The onus of those opportunities should not be directly on autistic or disabled people or their loved ones. It's got to be on the community. So when we recognized that, we started to reach out to local community programs. So, places like the Nashville Zoo and the Country Music Hall of Fame and Cheekwood Botanical Gardens and the Nashville Ballet and the Nashville Opera, all these places that families want to go and they want to engage with. We have about 40 community partners at this point. And what we set out to do was we want to teach you how to develop your environment in a way that's inclusive. It could be related to making their environment more predictable. So the zoo, for example, has maps on their website that show, the various ways you could go to avoid, loud noises or the jungle gym. They have a really great playground at the zoo that sometimes parents have a hard time moving their children on from. So there may be a social story for how to do that. There are different resources for how to be successful in those environments. But then also within activities. So how do you develop activities that are truly inclusive and that provide the types of supports that anybody would be successful with, but particularly thinking about individuals with autism or other disabilities. So we set out to do that with community partners, and we bring them together a couple of times a year, and they actually teach each other now. They've learned lessons, and they're a pretty strong coalition within primarily the city of Nashville, but in some other areas too, where we feel very comfortable telling families now, like, okay, you want to go to the zoo? Here's some resources they have on their website. Here's some other things they can provide. Their staff are trained in these areas, so you can go and feel comfortable doing that. And we've had great responses from the families that we've sent to those locations. And our partners have been really excited. And we're moving not only from the idea of how do you support people in your environment as a consumer, but how do you employ them too, right? And what does that look like to not only hire people with disabilities, but to retain them in employment in a way where they're happy and successful? So, it's really become a whole community approach to take much of the burden off of the individual with disabilities and their family, because the burden should not be on them, right? We should, as a community, wrap around them and figure out how to better provide those supports. And the last thing I'll say is when we do that, we really lift everybody up, right? If we can develop those types of supports in that way, it really benefits everyone.
Absolutely. And oftentimes I would imagine community members, they have good intent. They'd love to be a participant. They don't know where to start. And you guys have given that platform for them to be actively involved. Nobody, I would imagine, nobody wants to exclude people from environments. Nobody wants to do that, but they don't always have the knowledge set to start the process. And once you start it seems like it's like a snowball. It's like, I'm going to figure this out. I saw it in Utah once with restaurants. They did similar to what you're describing right there, where they got a bunch of restaurants together to talk about how to be able to create an environment within those groups to open up more opportunities where families don't feel scared to bring their child because of others' reactions or the environmental setup, and not feeling like I could ever do it again because I had one bad experience, but instead is create the community around them. So all of that, I think, is so valuable. And the more that we do that, the more you create an inclusive world. But you also had mentioned is that there's another part to community-based instruction, is that there's a second tier. Not only do you have to create the community that's willing to evolve around people who might require some different supports in different environments, but there's got to be a way to do it where you are being more cognizant of your approach and your treatment planning. So what is that piece to this? What is it that you're working on there?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to culture change and thinking about how to do that well. So even in this work I just described from a whole community standpoint, it's the idea that, we need to move away from this idea that we need to change people so they can fit into the culture. We need to change the culture to better fit anybody who's got different needs, has disabilities, requires supports. There's ways to do that well. At the individual level, we need to have that perspective too. Is what we're asking the people we're serving to learn. So, for example, through behavior analysis, one of the programs that we run is a statewide school-based behavior analysis program, where we end up working with students who require some of the highest resources in the state. So it's not uncommon for us to have a school come to us and request support because they have a student who maybe only comes to school a couple of hours a day because they engage in high rates and of severe and dangerous behavior. And when they're there for those 2 hours a day, they may be with 2, 3, 4 adults full time to help provide safety. And so, those are typically the students we work with in this particular program. Oftentimes, almost all the time, they'll have some level of intellectual and developmental disability. But even with that, it doesn't mean that our focus needs to be on decreasing behavior, right? We certainly want to make sure that we see a reduction in dangerous behavior, but it's not by changing that person to fit the needs of the environment. It's really, what does this person need to learn to be successful? We're going to teach them skills so that way they no longer have to engage in those dangerous behaviors. And then we're going to continue to work with that team. The benefit we're in is we don't have to clinically bill to maintain our services. We have a grant contract with the state that allows us to work long term with some of these students. So we may identify what the student needs from a communication standpoint, an academic standpoint, a behavioral standpoint right off the bat. We may be able to teach them the skills that allow us to see behavior reduction pretty quickly. But then we want to spend a lot more time with that student to make sure we're building those foundational communication and academic skills so they can remain engaged, they can remain happy, and they can remain successful. We don't see renewal or resurgence of some of those dangerous behaviors. And they're increasingly in an environment where their presence is sustainable because they are successful. And that takes time to build those skills. That takes time to build those relationships and sometimes change that culture within the schools. So that's our general approach, but there's a lot of things we do there that are pretty different, I think, too. And it all comes down to, for us, our community-informed practice approach. And so, a couple of years ago, we started to really understand, I would say 7 to 8 years ago, we started to really understand the growing opposition to applied behavior analysis and some of the goals of applied behavior analysis. And our team spent a lot of time with the feedback we were hearing from the community on social media and in person from families, from individuals that we're working with and providing services to. And we developed an approach through a set of guiding principles that I won't go into a lot of detail here, but we developed a set of guiding principles that really guide our work in this particular program. And we ran those by our community advisory committee at the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center and the ARC of Tennessee's family engagement team and various other organizations and people. Received feedback, made adjustments, got more feedback, and kind of settled on this community-informed approach where the things we're doing, we feel like, are informed directly by the community. What does that mean? It means a lot of different things, but some of the big things you may hear about is, compliance. We feel like there's no need for compliance goals, and the goals that we write or that we help teachers reframe when they ask for compliance goals, or if families may ask us for those, is how do we reframe that into engagement, cooperation, or safety goals? And that may sound like a small thing. It may sound semantic, but it's not, because if we're focusing on just compliance, oftentimes service delivery stops at that point, and the expectation from the people who ask us to come in are that we stop at that point because we've achieved following directions. We've achieved the ability to comply when we ask somebody to. But if we reframe it into cooperation, engagement, or safety, then we can develop goals and skills that build and that are foundational for other goals and skills. And so once we accomplish those, the people who call us in to provide these services are typically really excited to see what's next and to be able to build off that. So we developed this sort of proactive approach. But those are things that our community partners have told us, like, you have to do. You can't engage in compliance goals. An important form of compliance is conformity. So oftentimes we'll get calls about a student in a classroom who's engaging in maybe high rates of hand flapping. And if it's not dangerous, and if it's not extremely disruptive, then we will go in and we'll work on reframing what that is. And it doesn't mean we're going to work on decreasing the self-stimulatory behavior. If it's not dangerous and not extremely disruptive, we won't. But what we're going to do is, okay, well, what are your goals for this person? What are some other things we can work on, and how can we educate and be able to provide some support? So that's important to us too. So there's a lot more to it, but what I will say is that we have focused heavily on feedback from the community, embedded that within kind of the core of what we do. And that's how we provide services. The last thing I'll say, if I may, is that's not enough for us. The next thing we want to do is move towards community assessed practice. So community informed practice for us means we've done the initial legwork, we've gotten the initial feedback, and we're moving forward. Now, any behavior analyst or practitioner knows that if you set a certain model, it's easy to drift from that, and it's easy to see variances in that, especially as kind of idiosyncratic things come up. So what we're going to be doing within the next 6 months is meeting regularly, probably 2 to 3 times a year, with a community advisory committee that is diverse. It's going to include autistic people, other caregivers, other practitioners, families, educators. But what we'll do is really walk through the work we've done over whatever period of time it's been. Look at aggregated goals, look at interventions, talk about tricky decision-making situations we were in, but really to get assessment on a regular basis of our work and be able to modify and make adjustments to that. And that's not too much for people to ask. People are telling us they want accountability as behavior analysts. And so it's actually not that hard to provide in the position we're in, because again, we don't have to worry about billing. We have grants and contracts and other things to be able to support that work. Since we can do it, we're going to do it.
No, and what you're doing right now, I think, is just creating a practice model that is more centered on empowerment and giving more opportunity. And maybe this is a big ask of you, but you've talked to a lot of families. I'd love to hear kind of what that psyche of the family or of the child is if what you are describing isn't happening, if that child is being restricted all the time, if they're not feeling like they have value because they're being told to change all these aspects about them instead of trying to empower them with more tools, and you're focused on the wrong things. Like, how's that feeling being presented to you?
A lot of anxiety and stress, a lot of fear, a lot of self-doubt. Those things are easy to creep in when we tell people, like, what you're doing is wrong and you need to do this instead. And when it's an intrinsically hard thing for somebody to do, it becomes really challenging. We work with students who have autism or ADHD or other or sometimes emotional behavior disorders. And there are things that come along with that level of neurodiversity that can be extremely challenging for some people, from executive functioning to self-regulation. And when that's an intrinsic challenge, trying to tell somebody that they're not doing it well doesn't do anything but add stress and anxiety, and oftentimes leads to more challenges for that individual, and sometimes places them in environments or in situations where they're not safe. So we see a lot with, emotional behavior disorder, for example. Minority children are often overdiagnosed or overplaced in situations where they end up in restricted settings because they have emotional behavior disorder or some other type of neurodiversity like autism or ADHD. And that places them in a restrictive setting right off the bat. That places a lot more contingencies and structure around a person that maybe isn't conducive to the way they learn or the way they want to live. And that becomes really challenging for that person and can create big issues down the road. I've talked to a number of adults who have talked about the things they've done to deal with that sort of stress and anxiety, sometimes self-harm, sometimes overindulging in substances, sometimes overindulging in sexual activity or engaging in sexual activity they don't want to. There's a lot of things we see down the line that comes out of this anxiety and stress that we really, really need to understand is a real issue and a real concern if we don't change the way we practice and the way we approach the types of challenges that we're trying to solve.
No, it's a very interesting perspective, and one I hope that more people are starting to share as understanding is that not doing the appropriate thing with a practice, whether that's behavioral or if that's social emotional practices, is that you could influence the wrong social outcomes. And I'd love to just have a little bit more of an understanding of, you talked about community assessed practices. And is that the way that we are going to start removing some of that stigma, misconceptions, and improve social outcomes over time, is by being able to readily evaluate them?
I think it has to be. I mean, the way behavior analysis, for example, is developed, and again, I'm obviously a behavior analyst and a little bit biased in that regard, but I will say that there are other professions who are actively dealing with these same issues, including speech language pathology. But these have been issues that large service professions have been dealing with for a long time. What we need to learn at the point in our field is how to listen and how to change the way we behave. We are not providing services at large scale in the way that is really conducive to long-term success and outcomes oftentimes. So I think getting that type of community assessment on our work, ensuring that our values and our professional judgment are headed in the right direction based off the accountability that communities want us to have, is vital. If we're not doing that, then we're going to lose our way pretty easily. And I think we see that a lot of times, and especially when we end up seeing behavior programs from local or other national behavior analysis centers or clinics that really are cookie cutter or pushing 40-hour-a-week programs or really trying to figure out how to optimize their income by providing more services than they need to, or services in a way that's more restrictive than they need to be. That seems to happen quite a bit and in a growing amount. And I'll say beyond that, that's how we can focus on that from a local practice standpoint. But that needs to be a bigger perspective from statewide and national levels too. We are not doing ourselves as a field, doing ourselves a favor as a field if what we do is try to demystify every argument that comes up against applied behavior analysis. If we argue against it and tell somebody why they're wrong, we're just digging ourselves much deeper in trouble and making it harder to be able to demonstrate the substantive change some people are trying to make. It really traps us in a way as a whole field that can be really hard to, I guess, I don't want to say fight against, that's not the right word, but to be able to change perception. But we can't do that on our own, right? Like, I've been able to go in and have conversations with a lot of autistic people and a lot of caregivers and other folks about behavior change. But it's because we've demonstrated the ability to listen to communities and make changes based off that for a couple of years now. So I don't believe we can have those conversations until there's some demonstration that we're actually listening and changing and consistently assessing what we're doing and that we're accountable. And the best way I know to do that, at least in the way we do work, is through some level of community assessed practice.
No, and I couldn't agree more. I think that having those conversations and being honest and understanding perspective is the only way to be able to start evolving over time. It doesn't mean that the science is wrong. It means that the application has to always be fine-tuned. And I've seen that over the years. It's got to continue. It's got to be that trajectory. And I mean, and you hit on prescribing of care. Is that it's an individual assessment, as prescriptions should be individualized. And oftentimes is that if an organization is just defaulting to this is how we do it, versus saying is I'm going to look at each one of these individuals as an individual and look at what the needs are and what they are requiring or requesting. Well, let's take all that into into consideration as I'm trying to evaluate the appropriate treatment plan. It sounds like you guys are tackling so much right now, and it's probably too much to get into everything at the moment. And I think one thing I do want to leave all the listeners with is the ability to kind of start reading up on this themselves. I don't think this should be a Nashville-centric thing. I think this should be a model that should be looked at and replicated to give that same sort of effort that you're doing right now a chance to have a national scale to it. I think that we should all be learning from these experiences and all the research that you all have put in. So where can people find the resources about community-informed practice in general?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I think in terms of, our larger whole community work, there's a lot of that on our website in terms of the partners we work with and events that come up. And I think that's an important resource. We have a page that's going to be coming up soon that talks about our Autistic Advisory Committee. And so this is something that we've developed within the last year. We've had a community advisory committee that's been pretty diverse, but we wanted one that was specifically made up of autistic people. And so we're going to have a web page coming up soon that talks about the development of that and the building relationships with those folks and the way that they really help improve our work and provide us really important guidance. So I think that's one thing that can be helpful. And then we are in the process of actually getting our guiding principles. We call them our review of practice questions. Those are about to be put up on a web page as well. So I would encourage you to check back on that. And what we plan to do is build resources around that over the next couple of years and have, interns from the Vanderbilt University ABA program and other programs and some of our own behavior analysts being able to develop some of those resources to put out there at no cost. We believe very much in kind of, open sourcing everything we develop. So all that stuff will be there over the next couple of years, but we've worked to get to this point where we're just now starting to talk about it because we wanted to be comfortable with what we were doing, and we wanted to make sure that the people we're serving and our advisors are comfortable with what we're doing and that we're doing it in a way that reflects the needs of the community. And so we've spent a lot of purposeful time just digging into that by ourselves and really pushing that forward. But now I think we're at the point where we're really hoping to push a lot of that out and get that out to as many people as can use it. So I would kind of stay tuned to that over the next couple of years in terms of what's on the website. There will be resources up within the next, I would think, couple of weeks, actually. And then the other thing I would say is, we just hired a new director of behavior analysis research. We haven't had anybody in that position before. And he's going to be able to come in. His name is Adityan Rajarman, and he focuses a lot on trauma-informed care and is very much on board, appreciative, and supportive of a community-informed and assessed practice approach. And so we'll be able to develop more specific research around that area, but we've just been really focused on providing those services and doing it well.
And we'll definitely provide that link to the web page, and hopefully that is where any sort of TRIAD community engagement would be available as well. But I appreciate the work that you're doing on this. I think that, like anything else, Rome's not built in a day. So, I mean, it's going to take time, and you have to get buy-in from so many different people to make it valuable and to make it work. But it's also for us all to remember is that having flexibility in our thought and being able to understand somebody else's viewpoint and being able to realize we don't need to be rigid in our belief system is probably what's going to create this model of care that you're trying to establish. And you have me bought in, so hopefully you'll be able to convince so many others of the same thing. But we appreciate your time, Pablo.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.